Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart down the long hallway of Nexus Corporation's executive floor. The wheels squeaked softly against the polished marble tiles as she moved from office to office. It was nearly 9 in the evening and most of the employees had gone home for the day. Maria liked working the night shift because it meant fewer people around and she could clean in peace without anyone bothering her. She had been working at Nexus for 3 years now, and she knew every corner of the building. The company made weapons and military equipment for the government, and it was one of the biggest defense contractors in the country. Maria didn't know much about what they actually did, but she knew they made a lot of money doing it. Her job was simple, and she took pride in making sure everything was spotless and organized. She emptied trash bins, vacuumed carpets, wiped down desks, and made sure the bathrooms were clean. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and she needed the money to support herself and send some back to her family. Tonight, Maria was working on the 20th floor where all the top executives had their offices. This floor was different from the others because everything was more expensive and fancy. The desks were made of dark wood, the chairs were leather, and there were expensive paintings on the walls. Maria always felt a little nervous cleaning up here, because the executives could be mean if she made even the smallest mistake. She had learned to be extra careful and to stay out of their way as much as possible. As she approached the office of Richard Harper, the company's chief executive officer, she noticed the light was still on inside. That was unusual because Harper usually left by 7. Maria hesitated for a moment but then decided to go in and empty his trash bin quickly. She knocked lightly on the door but there was no answer, so she pushed it open and stepped inside. The office was huge with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Harper's desk was covered with papers and files and there was a half-empty cup of coffee sitting near the edge. Maria walked over to the trash bin beside the desk and bent down to pull out the plastic bag. As she stood up, her elbow accidentally knocked against the desk and the coffee cup tipped over. Brown liquid spilled across the desk and onto some papers that were lying there. Maria's heart jumped into her throat and she grabbed some tissues from her cart to try to clean it up. She worked as fast as she could, dabbing at the papers and trying to soak up the coffee before it could do too much damage. But it was too late because the papers were already soaked through and the ink was starting to run. Suddenly, the door burst open and Richard Harper stormed into the office. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He wore an expensive suit and his face was red with anger. Behind him, Maria could see several other executives standing in the hallway looking in. They must have been in a meeting somewhere nearby. Harper looked at his desk and then at Maria and his expression turned even angrier. He started shouting at her, calling her stupid and careless and asking if she had any idea what those papers were. Maria tried to apologize and explain that it was an accident, but Harper wouldn't listen. He kept yelling and his voice got louder and louder. The other executives in the hallway were watching now and Maria felt her face burning with embarrassment. She had never been yelled at like this before and she didn't know what to do. Then Harper did something that Maria would never forget. He grabbed her by the shoulder and pushed her down. Maria fell to her knees on the hard floor and looked up at him in shock. Harper stood over her with his arms crossed and told her that if she was going to act like an animal, then she would be treated like one. He told her to crawl and clean up the mess she had made. Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing, but Harper's face was serious and angry. She looked at the executives in the hallway and saw that some of them looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything to stop him. One man was even smiling like he thought it was funny. Maria felt tears starting to come, but she blinked them back. She got down on her hands and knees and started picking up the wet papers and wiping the floor. Harper stood there watching her the whole time with his arms crossed. He didn't move or say anything else, just watched her crawl around his office like a dog. It took several minutes to clean up the spill, and the whole time Maria felt the eyes of all those executives watching her. Her knees hurt from the hard floor and her hands were shaking. When she finally finished, Harper told her to get out of his sight. He said she was lucky she still had a job and that if she ever made another mistake like that, she would be fired immediately. Maria stood up slowly and pushed her cart out of the office. She kept her head down as she walked past the executives in the hallway. Some of them moved aside to let her pass and she could hear them whispering to each other. She made it to the service elevator and pressed the button with a trembling hand. As soon as the doors closed, she leaned against the wall and let the tears come. She had never felt so humiliated in her entire life. She had been treated like she was less than human, like she was worthless. Maria finished her shift that night, but she barely remembered doing it. She moved through the building like a ghost, cleaning automatically while her mind replayed what had happened over and over. When her shift finally ended at midnight, she changed out of her uniform and left the building. The night air was cold, and she pulled her jacket tight around herself as she walked to the bus stop. There were only a few other people waiting, and nobody looked at her. Maria sat down on the bench and stared at the ground. She thought about quitting, about never going back to that building again. But she needed the job, and finding another one wouldn't be easy. She was 42 years old with no college degree and not many options. She thought about her family back home who depended on the money she sent them every month. She thought about her small apartment and her bills that needed to be paid. But as she sat there waiting for the bus, something changed inside Maria. The humiliation she felt started to transform into something else, something harder and colder. She thought about Richard Harper standing over her, looking down at her like she was nothing. She thought about those executives watching and doing nothing to help her. They had treated her like she was invisible, like she didn't matter. And that was their mistake, because people who are invisible see everything. Maria had been cleaning that building for 3 years, and she had access to places most employees never saw. She had cleaned Harper's office dozens of times, and she had seen the papers on his desk, the files in his cabinets, the things he left lying around because he thought a janitor wouldn't understand or wouldn't care. But Maria understood more than they thought, and she did care. As the bus pulled up and the doors opened, Maria made a decision. She was going to make Richard Harper pay for what he had done to her, and she was going to destroy everything he had built. Maria lay in her bed that night staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. Sleep wouldn't come no matter how hard she tried, because her mind kept going back to what had happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard Harper's angry face and felt the hard floor under her knees. But something was different now, because instead of just feeling ashamed, Maria was starting to think. She thought about all the things she had seen during her 3 years working at Nexus Corporation. As a janitor, she was practically invisible to the executives, and they talked freely around her like she wasn't even there. They left important documents on their desks and held private conversations in the hallways while she cleaned nearby. They typed passwords on their computers without bothering to hide the screen, and they threw away papers that probably should have been shredded. Maria had never paid much attention to any of it before, because it wasn't her business and she just wanted to do her job. But now she realized she had been sitting on a gold mine of information, and she just hadn't known it. The next evening, Maria went back to work with a new sense of purpose. She still felt nervous walking into the building, but she pushed those feelings down and focused on what she needed to do. She started her shift as usual, cleaning the lower floors first and working her way up. But this time she paid attention to things she had ignored before. She looked at the papers on people's desks and the notes stuck to their computer monitors. She listened more carefully to the conversations she overheard. When she got to the executive floor, she took her time in each office, looking through trash bins more carefully and reading documents before throwing them away. In Richard Harper's office, she found something interesting in the recycling bin. It was a crumpled memo about something called Project Sentinel, which seemed to be a new weapons system the company was building for the military. The memo talked about production problems and cost overruns that were being hidden from government inspectors. Maria smoothed out the paper and read it carefully. She didn't understand all the technical words, but she understood enough to know that this was important. She took out her phone and snapped a photo of the memo, making sure to get the whole page in the frame. Over the next few weeks, Maria continued collecting information. She developed a system where she would photograph anything that looked important and store the images in a hidden folder on her phone. She found emails in the trash about safety tests that had been faked and reports that had been altered. She discovered sticky notes with passwords written on them and used those passwords to access files on computers that executives left unlocked. She was careful never to take anything or to leave any sign that she had been looking through things. She just took photos and moved on. The more Maria learned about Nexus Corporation, the more shocked she became. The company wasn't just cutting corners to save money. They were actively lying to the government and selling weapon systems that didn't work properly. They were using cheap materials instead of the military-grade components they were supposed to use, and then charging the government full price. They were falsifying test results to make it look like their products were safe when they actually had serious problems. One night, Maria found a whole stack of documents in a filing cabinet that had been left unlocked. The documents showed that Nexus had billed the government for work that was never actually done. They had claimed to have completed safety inspections and quality tests, but the documents proved those tests had never happened. Maria spent an hour photographing every page, her hands shaking with excitement and fear. She knew she was gathering evidence of massive fraud, but she also knew that what she was doing was dangerous. If anyone caught her going through these files, she would be fired immediately and might even be arrested. But she kept going because she felt like she had to. These people had humiliated her and treated her like she was nothing, and now she was going to make them pay. As Maria gathered more evidence, she started to understand just how big the fraud was. It wasn't just one project or one contract, it was everything the company did. Nexus had been lying to the government for years, maybe even decades. They had built a $2 billion empire on fraud and corruption, and Richard Harper knew all about it, because Maria found emails and memos with his name on them approving fake reports and authorizing the use of substandard materials. He wasn't just aware of the fraud, he was directing it. Maria also learned that some of the defective weapon systems Nexus had sold had actually failed in the field. There had been accidents and equipment failures that had put soldiers in danger. One memo mentioned an aircraft that had crashed due to a faulty guidance system made by Nexus. The company had managed to cover it up by blaming the crash on pilot error, but the internal documents told the real story. The more Maria learned, the angrier she became. These people were getting rich by cheating the government and putting soldiers' lives at risk. They lived in mansions and drove expensive cars while making weapons that could get people killed. And they thought they were untouchable because they had money and power and connections. They thought people like Maria didn't matter and couldn't hurt them. Maria knew she had enough evidence now to cause serious problems for Nexus Corporation, but she also knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help from someone who understood how to use this information and who could protect her from retaliation. She thought about who she could trust and remembered her old college roommate Lisa Chen. They had been close friends 20 years ago but had lost touch after graduation. Maria knew that Lisa had become a journalist and worked for a major newspaper. She found Lisa's email address online and sent her a message saying she had information about corporate fraud and asking if they could meet. Lisa responded the next day and they arranged to meet at a quiet diner on the other side of town. When Maria walked in, she saw Lisa sitting in a booth near the back. Lisa looked older, but Maria recognized her right away. They hugged and spent a few minutes catching up, but then Maria got down to business. She pulled out a folder containing printed copies of some of the documents she had photographed and slid it across the table. Lisa opened the folder and started reading. Her eyes got wider and wider as she flipped through the pages. When she finished, she looked up at Maria and asked if she understood what she had here. Maria said yes, that Nexus Corporation was committing fraud on a massive scale and that she wanted to expose them. Lisa asked why Maria was doing this, and Maria told her about the night Richard Harper had forced her to crawl on the floor like a dog. She told Lisa about the humiliation and the anger and the need to make things right. Lisa agreed to help, but she warned Maria that this was going to be difficult and dangerous. Nexus Corporation had billions of dollars and powerful friends in the government. They would fight back hard against anyone who threatened them. They would try to discredit Maria and destroy her reputation. They might even try to have her arrested for stealing company information. But Lisa also said that if the evidence was as solid as it looked, then they had a real chance of bringing the company down. She said they needed to build an airtight case with multiple sources and verification of all the facts. She said they would need to bring in lawyers and possibly federal investigators. Maria said she understood the risks and that she was ready to do whatever it took. They spent the next 2 hours going through the documents and making a plan. Lisa said she would start reaching out to other sources and verifying the information. She said she knew a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases and would set up a meeting. As Maria left the diner that night, she felt both terrified and hopeful. Lisa worked fast over the next week, reaching out to her contacts and trying to verify the information Maria had given her. She called former Nexus employees and spoke to people who worked in the defense industry. Everyone she talked to said the same thing, that Nexus Corporation had a reputation for cutting corners, and that there had always been rumors of fraud, but nobody had ever been able to prove it. Now Maria had provided the proof they needed. Lisa set up a meeting with a lawyer named Karen Wu, who had handled several big whistleblower cases. The 3 women met at Karen's office downtown, and Maria brought all the evidence she had collected. Karen spent 2 hours going through the documents and asking Maria detailed questions about how she had obtained them. When she finished, She sat back in her chair and told them this was one of the most comprehensive cases of corporate fraud she had ever seen. She said the evidence was solid and that Maria had a strong whistleblower claim under the False Claims Act. This law allowed private citizens to sue companies that were defrauding the government, and if the case was successful, Maria could receive a portion of whatever money the government recovered. Karen explained that they needed to be very careful about how they proceeded because Nexus would fight back with everything they had. She said they should keep gathering evidence for now but not go public until they were completely ready. She also said they needed someone from inside the company who could testify about the technical aspects of the fraud. Lisa said she might know someone who could help. She had been doing research on Nexus and found out that an engineer named Peter Nguyen had left the company 6 months earlier. Lisa had managed to track down his phone number, and when she called him, he agreed to meet. Peter was nervous when they met him at a coffee shop. He was a thin man in his 30s with dark circles under his eyes. He said he had left Nexus because he couldn't sleep at night knowing what the company was doing. He had been working on guidance systems for military aircraft and had discovered that the components Nexus was using were not reliable enough for combat situations. When he reported the problems to his supervisors, they told him to keep quiet. They said the cheap components saved money and that the military would never know the difference. Peter had refused to sign off on the systems and had been threatened with being fired. Eventually he quit, but they made him sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from talking about what he knew. Karen said that the evidence Maria had collected might be enough to void that non-disclosure agreement because it showed a pattern of illegal activity. She said Peter wouldn't be protected by the agreement if he was testifying about crimes. Peter was scared, but he agreed to help because he said people had died because of Nexus's defective systems. He told them about 3 military aircraft that had crashed in the past 2 years. The official reports blamed pilot error, but Peter said the real cause was faulty guidance systems made by Nexus. The company had covered it up by destroying test results and falsifying records. When Peter told them this story, he had tears in his eyes and his voice was shaking. He said he felt guilty every day for not speaking up sooner. Maria reached across the table and took his hand. She told him it wasn't his fault, and that they were going to make things right. Over the next month, the team met regularly to plan their strategy. Lisa continued investigating and found even more evidence of fraud. She discovered that Nexus had been bribing foreign officials to win contracts overseas. She found that the company had violated environmental regulations at their manufacturing plants and had covered it up. She learned that Richard Harper personally owned several shell companies that Nexus did business with, which meant he was essentially paying himself with government money. Karen prepared the legal documents for the whistleblower lawsuit. She also made contact with the FBI and the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. At first, the federal investigators were skeptical because they got tips about defense contractor fraud all the time, and most of them turned out to be nothing. But when Karen showed them some of the evidence, they became very interested. They opened formal investigations and started issuing subpoenas for Nexus records. Maria continued working at Nexus and gathering more evidence. She had become very good at moving through the building without being noticed and finding the most damaging documents. One night, she hit the jackpot when she found an email from Richard Harper to his chief financial officer. The email explicitly ordered him to destroy documents related to the defective guidance systems. Harper had written that he didn't care how it was done, just to make the problem disappear. This was exactly the kind of smoking gun they needed because it showed that Harper personally knew about the fraud and had tried to cover it up. Maria photographed the email and sent it to Karen immediately. Karen called her back within an hour and said this changed everything. This email alone could send Harper to prison. But Maria's activities hadn't gone completely unnoticed. The head of security at Nexus was a man named Greg Stone, who had worked there for 15 years. He was good at his job, and he had started to notice some irregularities. The computer logs showed that someone was accessing files in the executive offices late at night. At first, Greg thought it might be one of the executives working late, but when he checked the badge access records, he saw that it was Maria Santos, the janitor. Greg didn't think much of it at first because janitors needed access to all the offices to do their jobs. But then he noticed that Maria was spending more time in certain offices than seemed necessary for cleaning. He started watching the security camera footage and saw Maria taking photos of documents with her phone. Greg didn't know what to make of this. He wondered if Maria was planning to steal something or if she was working for a competitor. He decided to keep watching her and gather more evidence before reporting it to his superiors. Meanwhile, Maria was starting to feel the pressure. She knew they were getting close to going public, but every day she went to work, she felt like someone was watching her. She started having nightmares about getting caught and being arrested. She was exhausted from the stress and from working 2 jobs, her regular cleaning job and her secret job of gathering evidence. Lisa noticed that Maria looked tired and warned her to be careful. She said they were almost ready to go public and that Maria just needed to hold on a little longer. Karen agreed and said they should aim to file the lawsuit and release the story within the next 2 weeks. She said the FBI was ready to move forward with raids on Nexus headquarters and that everything was coming together. The team had one final meeting to coordinate the timing of everything. They decided that Lisa would publish her article on a Tuesday morning. At the same time, Karen would file the whistleblower lawsuit in federal court. The FBI would execute search warrants at Nexus headquarters and at Richard Harper's home. The Department of Defense would announce that they were suspending all contracts with Nexus, pending the outcome of the investigation. They wanted everything to happen at once so that Nexus wouldn't have time to destroy evidence or prepare a defense. Maria asked what would happen to her after the story came out. Karen said she would probably need to go into hiding for a while because Nexus would try to retaliate. She said Maria should plan to take some time off work and stay with friends or family. Lisa offered to let Maria stay at her apartment until things calmed down. Maria agreed and started packing a bag with clothes and essentials. The night before everything was set to happen, Maria went to work at Nexus for what she thought might be the last time. She cleaned the offices slowly, taking in every detail and thinking about how different things would be tomorrow. When she got to Richard Harper's office, she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his big desk and expensive furniture. She remembered the night he had forced her to crawl and how small and powerless she had felt. But she didn't feel powerless anymore. Tomorrow the whole world would know what Harper had done, and his empire would start to crumble. Maria smiled to herself and then turned off the light and closed the door. As she pushed her cleaning cart toward the elevator, she saw Greg Stone standing near the security desk watching her. Their eyes met for a moment and Maria felt her heart start to race. Did he know what she had been doing? Was he going to stop her? But Greg just nodded at her and Maria nodded back. She got on the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, she let out a long breath. It was almost over. The story broke early on Tuesday morning when Lisa's newspaper published a massive front-page article with the headline, "Defense Contractor Accused of Massive Fraud. Military Lives at Risk." The article detailed everything that Nexus Corporation had done wrong over the past decade. It described how they had used cheap components instead of military-grade materials while charging the government full price. It explained how they had falsified safety tests and hidden defects in their weapon systems. It told the story of the 3 aircraft crashes that had been caused by faulty Nexus guidance systems. And it included quotes from Peter Nguyen describing how executives had pressured engineers to ignore safety problems. The article also mentioned Maria Santos, identifying her as a whistleblower who had worked as a janitor at Nexus and had gathered evidence of the fraud over several months. Lisa had been careful not to include too many personal details about Maria to protect her privacy, but she did mention the incident where Richard Harper had forced Maria to crawl on the floor. That detail captured people's attention and made the story personal. At the exact same time the article was published, Karen filed the whistleblower lawsuit in federal court. The filing included hundreds of pages of evidence and detailed allegations of fraud totaling over $1 billion. The lawsuit named Richard Harper and several other top executives as defendants. Within an hour of the filing, the FBI showed up at Nexus headquarters with search warrants. Dozens of agents in blue jackets stormed into the building and began seizing computers, files, and documents. Employees stood around in shock watching as agents carried boxes out of executive offices. At the same time, another team of FBI agents raided Richard Harper's mansion in the suburbs. They searched his home office and seized his personal computers and files. Harper was there when they arrived, and he stood in his driveway in his bathrobe watching as agents carried out boxes of evidence. News helicopters circled overhead filming everything. The Department of Defense issued a statement saying they were immediately suspending all contracts with Nexus Corporation pending the outcome of criminal and civil investigations. This was a huge blow because government contracts made up about 70% of Nexus's business. Without those contracts, the company would struggle to survive. The stock market opened at 9:30 that morning, and Nexus stock immediately went into free fall. Within the first hour of trading, the stock price had dropped by 40%. By the end of the day, it was down 60%, wiping out over $1 billion in market value. Investors were panicking and trying to sell their shares, but there weren't many buyers. The company that had been worth $2 billion just yesterday was now worth less than $1 billion and falling fast. Richard Harper held an emergency press conference at noon. He stood in front of the Nexus building surrounded by his lawyers and tried to project confidence. He called the allegations completely false and baseless. He said Maria Santos was a disgruntled employee who had been fired for poor performance and was trying to get revenge. This was a lie because Maria had never been fired. She had quit on her own. Harper said the lawsuit was a shakedown attempt and that Nexus would fight it vigorously. He said the company had always operated with the highest ethical standards and that every product they made met or exceeded government specifications. As Harper talked, reporters shouted questions at him. One reporter asked about the email where he had ordered documents to be destroyed. Harper's face went red and he said the email had been taken out of context. Another reporter asked about the 3 aircraft crashes. Harper said those crashes were caused by pilot error and had nothing to do with Nexus products. But his voice sounded uncertain and he was sweating under the television lights. After about 15 minutes, his lawyers ended the press conference and rushed him back inside the building. Inside Nexus headquarters, there was complete chaos. Employees gathered in small groups whispering about what was happening. Many people were updating their resumes and looking for new jobs because they knew the company was in serious trouble. Several senior executives who weren't named in the lawsuit quietly hired their own lawyers. The board of directors held an emergency meeting to discuss what to do. Some board members wanted to fire Harper immediately, but others argued that firing him would look like an admission of guilt. They couldn't agree on what to do, so they issued a statement saying they were conducting their own internal investigation. Meanwhile, the FBI agents were still there going through files and interviewing employees. Every person who worked in the executive offices was questioned about what they knew and when they knew it. Maria watched all of this unfold from Lisa's apartment. She had taken the day off work and was staying hidden as Karen had advised. She sat on Lisa's couch watching the news coverage on television, and she could hardly believe what she was seeing. The company that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was falling apart right before her eyes. She saw Richard Harper on TV looking sweaty and defensive, and she felt a sense of satisfaction, but she also felt scared because she knew this was just the beginning. Karen had warned her that Nexus would try to destroy her reputation and that things would get ugly. Sure enough, by that afternoon, Nexus's lawyers had started their counterattack. They issued a statement calling Maria a thief who had stolen proprietary company information. They said she had violated her employment contract and broken the law. They threatened to sue her and have her prosecuted for industrial espionage. They also started leaking stories to friendly reporters suggesting that Maria was mentally unstable and had made up the allegations because she was angry about being disciplined for poor work. Performance Karen expected this and was ready to fight back. She held her own press conference and showed reporters copies of the evidence Maria had gathered. She displayed the email from Harper ordering documents destroyed. She showed the falsified safety reports and the memos about defective components. She had Peter Negin appear with her, and he testified about being pressured to ignore safety problems. Karen also revealed that the FBI and Department of Defense had been investigating Nexus for months, based on the evidence Maria provided, and that they had found even more proof of fraud. She said Maria was a hero who had put her career and safety at risk to expose corruption that was endangering soldiers' lives. The reporters ate it up, and the next day's headlines were much more favorable to Maria. Still, the attacks from Nexus continued. They hired private investigators to dig into Maria's past, looking for anything embarrassing they could use against her. They contacted her ex-husband and tried to get him to say bad things about her. They talked to former employers and old friends, but they didn't find much because Maria had lived a quiet, honest life. As the days went by, more and more information came out about Nexus Corporation. Other former employees started coming forward with their own stories of fraud and misconduct. One woman said she had been fired for refusing to falsify test results. Another man said he had witnessed executives bribing foreign officials to win contracts. The media coverage was relentless, and every major news network was covering the story. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and several senators gave speeches calling for a complete overhaul of how defense contractors were monitored. The scandal became national news, and everyone was talking about it. Richard Harper became the symbol of corporate greed and corruption. Late-night television hosts made jokes about him, and his face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like, "The $2 billion fraud." Harper tried to keep working, but it was impossible. Protesters showed up outside Nexus headquarters every day, chanting and holding signs. His neighbors complained about news cameras camped outside his house. His children were being harassed at school. The pressure was immense. Inside Nexus, the situation kept getting worse. The company announced it was laying off 30% of its workforce to cut costs. Without government contracts, they couldn't afford to keep everyone employed. The layoffs affected thousands of families and made the company even more unpopular. Several of the company's commercial customers announced they were taking their business elsewhere because they didn't want to be associated with Nexus. The company's credit rating was downgraded, which made it harder to borrow money. Banks that had loaned money to Nexus started getting nervous and demanding early repayment. The company was bleeding cash and running out of options. The board of directors finally forced Richard Harper to take a leave of absence. They appointed an interim chief executive and promised to cooperate fully with investigators. But the damage was done, and everyone knew the company was doomed. Maria continued to watch all of this from a safe distance. She moved around between different friends' apartments to avoid being found by reporters or Nexus investigators. Karen kept her updated on the legal proceedings. The government had joined Maria's whistleblower lawsuit, which meant they believed the allegations were credible. This was a huge victory because it gave the case much more weight. Karen said they were now in the discovery phase, where both sides would exchange evidence and take depositions. The legal battle dragged on for months, and it was even more brutal than Maria had expected. Nexus Corporation hired the most expensive law firm in Washington, and they fought the whistleblower lawsuit with everything they had. Their strategy was simple: attack Maria's credibility and make the case so complicated that people would lose interest. They filed dozens of motions trying to get the case dismissed. They argued that Maria had stolen proprietary information and violated her employment contract. They claimed she didn't have standing to bring the lawsuit because she wasn't directly harmed by the fraud. They said the False Claims Act didn't apply to this situation. Karen fought back against every motion, and the judge rejected most of them. The judge said that Maria clearly had standing as a whistleblower, and that the False Claims Act was designed for exactly this type of case. He also said that any confidentiality agreements Maria had signed were void because they couldn't be used to cover up illegal activity. This was a big win, but Nexus's lawyers weren't done yet. They launched a full-scale attack on Maria's character. Private investigators followed her around and tried to catch her doing something that would make her look bad. They interviewed everyone who had ever known her, looking for dirt. They found her ex-husband and got him to sign an affidavit saying Maria had been unstable during their marriage. This wasn't true, and Maria's lawyer was able to prove that the ex-husband had been paid by Nexus to lie. But the damage was done because the story was already out there. Nexus's lawyers also claimed that Maria had a history of making false accusations. They pointed to a complaint she had filed years ago against a previous employer for wage theft. They tried to make it seem like Maria was someone who was always looking for someone to sue. Karen showed that the previous complaint had been legitimate and that Maria had won that case. She also pointed out that Nexus was trying to distract from the actual evidence of fraud by attacking Maria personally. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed even more damaging information about Nexus. The company was forced to turn over millions of documents, and Karen's team found evidence of fraud going back 15 years. They found that Richard Harper had personally approved the use of substandard materials on dozens of government contracts. They found emails where executives joked about fooling government inspectors. They found internal memos showing that the company knew their guidance systems had defects but sold them anyway. One particularly damning document was a risk assessment that calculated how many accidents the defective systems would likely cause. The document concluded that the cost of lawsuits from a few accidents would be less than the cost of fixing the systems properly, so the company decided to take the risk. When this document became public, it caused outrage. People couldn't believe that a company would knowingly put lives at risk just to save money. Peter Nguyen gave a deposition that lasted 3 days. He explained in technical detail how Nexus's guidance systems worked and what was wrong with them. He described the pressure he had faced from executives to approve systems he knew were unsafe. He broke down crying when he talked about the 3 pilots who had died in crashes caused by Nexus equipment. The lawyers for Nexus tried to discredit him by saying he was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. But Peter had kept detailed notes and emails from his time at the company, and everything he said was backed up by documentation. His testimony was devastating to Nexus's defense. Other former employees also came forward to testify. An accountant described how the company kept 2 sets of books, one for internal use and one for government auditors. A quality control inspector said he had been ordered to pass components that didn't meet specifications. A procurement manager testified about bribing foreign officials to win contracts overseas. Each new witness made the case against Nexus stronger. While the civil lawsuit proceeded, the criminal investigation was also moving forward. A grand jury was convened and began hearing testimony from witnesses. Federal prosecutors were building a case against Richard Harper and several other top executives. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened its own investigation into whether Nexus had committed securities fraud by lying to investors about the company's financial condition and the quality of its products. A class action lawsuit was filed by shareholders who had lost money when Nexus stock collapsed. The company was being attacked from all sides, and it was clear they couldn't survive much longer. The new chief executive tried to turn things around by cleaning house. He fired several senior executives who had been involved in the fraud. He hired an outside firm to review all of the company's products and contracts. He publicly apologized to the military and to the families of the pilots who had died. But it was too little too late. The company's reputation was destroyed and nobody wanted to do business with them. 6 months after the scandal broke, the Department of Justice announced indictments against Richard Harper and 5 other executives. They were charged with conspiracy to defraud the government, making false statements, obstruction of justice, and wire fraud. The indictments detailed a pattern of criminal behavior spanning more than a decade. Harper was also charged with witness tampering for trying to pressure employees not to cooperate with investigators. When the indictments were unsealed, Harper surrendered to federal authorities. He was arraigned in court and pleaded not guilty to all charges. The judge set bail at $5 million, which Harper was able to post. He left the courthouse surrounded by his lawyers and refused to answer questions from reporters. His trial was scheduled to begin in 6 months. As Harper's criminal trial approached, the whistleblower lawsuit was moving toward a settlement. The government had calculated that Nexus had defrauded them of approximately $1.8 billion over the course of 15 years. Karen negotiated with the Justice Department and Nexus's lawyers to reach an agreement. Nexus wanted to settle because they knew they would lose if the case went to trial, and the penalties would be even worse. The government wanted to settle because it would allow them to recover money quickly, without the expense and uncertainty of a trial. After weeks of negotiation, they reached a settlement for $1.8 billion. This was one of the largest fraud settlements in history. Under the False Claims Act, Maria was entitled to receive between 15 and 30% of the recovery. After long discussions with the Justice Department, it was agreed that Maria would receive 20%, which came out to $360 million. After Karen took her legal fees and Maria paid taxes, she would still end up with approximately $320 million. It was an almost unimaginable amount of money for someone who had been working as a janitor making barely above minimum wage, but Maria didn't have time to think about the money yet, because Richard Harper's criminal trial was starting. The trial took place in federal court, and it was one of the most closely watched trials of the year. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case against Harper. They showed the jury thousands of documents proving that Harper had known about and directed the fraud. They played recordings of phone calls where Harper discussed covering up problems. They presented testimony from more than 50 witnesses, including former employees, government inspectors, and military officials. The most dramatic testimony came from the widow of one of the pilots who had died in a crash caused by defective Nexus equipment. She described how her husband had been excited about his new assignment flying advanced aircraft. She talked about getting the phone call telling her he was dead. She said her children had grown up without a father because Nexus Corporation decided that saving money was more important than safety. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when she finished testifying. Harper's defense team tried to argue that he had been misled by his subordinates and didn't know the full extent of the fraud. They claimed he was just a chief executive who relied on others to handle the details, and that he shouldn't be held responsible for what happened below him. But the prosecution destroyed this argument by showing email after email, where Harper gave explicit orders to falsify reports, use cheap materials, and hide problems from inspectors. The most damaging evidence was the email where Harper told his chief financial officer to destroy documents related to the defective guidance systems. There was no way to explain that away. The trial lasted 5 weeks and the jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former Nexus employees, and families of the crash victims. Harper sat at the defense table looking pale and nervous. The judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Harper closed his eyes and his shoulders slumped. His lawyers asked for him to remain free on bail pending sentencing, but the judge denied the request and ordered Harper to be taken into custody immediately. Federal marshals put handcuffs on Harper and led him out of the courtroom. Maria watched from the back row, feeling a sense of justice finally being served. Richard Harper's sentencing hearing took place 3 months after his conviction. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been during the trial, because everyone wanted to see what would happen to the man who had become the symbol of corporate greed and corruption. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. They argued that Harper had shown no remorse for his crimes and had caused immeasurable harm to national security and to the families of the soldiers who died because of his company's defective products. Harper's lawyers asked for leniency, arguing that he was a 60-year-old man with no prior criminal record, and that a long prison sentence would effectively be a life sentence. They said Harper had already lost everything, including his company, his fortune, and his reputation. They presented letters from Harper's family members begging the judge to be merciful. Harper himself was given a chance to speak, and he stood up and addressed the court. He said he took full responsibility for what had happened at Nexus Corporation, and that he was sorry for the harm he had caused. But his apology rang hollow, because throughout the trial he had maintained his innocence and blamed everyone else for the problems. Several victims were allowed to speak at the sentencing hearing. The widow of the pilot who died testified again about how Harper's greed had destroyed her family. A former Nexus employee talked about how he had been fired and blacklisted in the industry for trying to report safety problems. A military officer described how defective Nexus equipment had put his soldiers in danger during combat operations. Each testimony added weight to the argument that Harper deserved a harsh sentence. When everyone had finished speaking, the judge took a moment before delivering his ruling. He said this was one of the most egregious cases of corporate fraud he had seen in his 30 years on the bench. He said Harper had betrayed the trust of the American people and endangered national security for personal profit. He noted that Harper had shown a pattern of putting money above human life and had tried to cover up his crimes by destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses. The judge sentenced Richard Harper to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Harper would be 77 years old when he was released if he lived that long. The judge also ordered Harper to forfeit all of his personal assets, including his mansion, his vacation homes, his cars, and his bank accounts. Everything would be sold and the money would go to compensating victims and paying back the government. Harper was immediately taken into custody and transported to a federal prison in another state. His wife filed for divorce within a week of the sentencing, and his children refused to speak to him. The man who had once been one of the most powerful executives in the defense industry was now just another prisoner. The other executives who had been indicted also received significant prison sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The company's chief financial officer got 12 years. The head of engineering got 10 years, and several vice presidents got between 5 and 8 years. All of them lost their personal fortunes and their careers were over. The message was clear that corporate executives who commit fraud would face serious consequences. Meanwhile, Nexus Corporation was in its final death spiral. The $1.8 billion settlement had bankrupted the company. They couldn't pay it all at once, so a payment plan was arranged, but even that was too much for them to handle. The company had no more government contracts and most of their commercial customers had left. They were losing money every month and running out of cash. The board of directors held a final meeting and voted to file for bankruptcy protection. This set off a process where the company's assets would be sold off to pay creditors, and the remaining employees would lose their jobs. The bankruptcy auction was held 6 months later. Several companies bid on different pieces of Nexus. One competitor bought the manufacturing facilities, another bought some of the patents and technology. A private equity firm bought the commercial division, but nobody wanted to buy the company as a whole because the Nexus name was too toxic. Everything was broken up and sold in pieces. The headquarters building where Maria had worked as a janitor was sold to a real estate developer who planned to convert it into apartments. By the end of the bankruptcy process, Nexus Corporation had ceased to exist. The $2 billion empire that Richard Harper had built over decades was completely gone. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. Investors lost billions of dollars and the Nexus name disappeared from the business world, all because of the evidence that Maria Santos had gathered while cleaning offices late at night. The scandal also led to significant changes in how defense contractors were regulated. Congress passed new laws requiring more oversight of military contracts and imposing harsher penalties for fraud. The Department of Defense implemented new procedures that made it easier for employees to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Whistleblower protections were strengthened and rewards for reporting fraud were increased. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were a step in the right direction. Maria's life had changed completely. She had gone from being a janitor living in a small apartment to being a wealthy woman with more money than she had ever imagined. But the journey had taken a toll on her. The stress of gathering evidence, the fear of being caught, the attacks on her character and the months of legal battles had been exhausting. She had trouble sleeping and often had nightmares about being back at Nexus cleaning Harper's office. She saw a therapist to help deal with the trauma. The therapist told her that what she was experiencing was normal for whistleblowers who go through such intense scrutiny and pressure. Many whistleblowers suffer from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress even after they win their cases. Maria also struggled with the publicity. Her name and face were all over the news, and everywhere she went, people recognized her. Some people treated her like a hero and wanted to thank her. Others were angry because they had lost money when Nexus stock crashed, or because they had worked at Nexus and lost their jobs. Maria received both fan mail and death threats. She had to hire security guards and move to a safer neighborhood. The money from the settlement was helpful, but it couldn't protect her from all the attention and scrutiny. Despite the challenges, Maria was determined to use her experience and her money to help others. She didn't want to just sit around and enjoy being wealthy, when there were so many other workers out there facing the same kinds of problems she had faced. She decided to create a foundation that would support whistleblowers and protect workers' rights. She worked with Karen and Lisa to establish the Santos Foundation for whistleblower protection and worker rights. The foundation had 3 main goals. First, it provided legal support for employees who witnessed corporate wrongdoing and wanted to report it. Many people who see fraud or safety violations at their companies are too scared to speak up because they can't afford lawyers and they fear retaliation. The foundation would pay for their legal representation and help them navigate the complex whistleblower laws. Second, the foundation offered financial assistance to whistleblowers who lost their jobs or faced other economic hardship because of reporting misconduct. Maria knew from personal experience how scary it was to risk your livelihood to do the right thing. The foundation would help people pay their bills while their cases worked through the legal system. Third, the foundation advocated for stronger laws protecting workers from retaliation and making it easier to hold corporations accountable for fraud and safety violations. Maria hired a small team of people to run the foundation, including a lawyer, a policy expert, and a communications director. She rented office space and began accepting applications from people who needed help. Within the first 6 months, the foundation was supporting over 50 whistleblower cases across various industries. Some involved healthcare fraud, others environmental violations, and still others concerned financial crimes. Maria reviewed each case personally and met with many of the whistleblowers. She listened to their stories and offered advice based on her own experience. She told them that the path would be difficult, but that speaking up was the right thing to do. She warned them about the attacks they would face and the toll it would take on their mental health and relationships, but she also told them that they were not alone and that she would support them every step of the way. The foundation quickly gained a reputation as a serious organization that got results. Several of the cases it supported led to major settlements and criminal prosecutions. Corporate executives started to realize that they couldn't silence whistleblowers anymore, because there was now an organization with significant resources backing them up. Maria's work with the foundation brought her into contact with people from all walks of life who had witnessed wrongdoing and decided to speak up. She met a nurse who exposed a hospital that was performing unnecessary surgeries to bill insurance companies for more money. She met a factory worker who reported that his employer was dumping toxic chemicals into a river. She met an accountant who discovered that her company was helping wealthy clients hide money from the tax authorities. Each person had a different story, but they all shared the same qualities: courage and a belief that doing the right thing was more important than protecting themselves. Maria found these meetings both inspiring and heartbreaking. She was inspired by the bravery these people showed, but heartbroken by the suffering they endured. Many of them had lost their jobs, their homes, and their relationships because they chose to speak up. Some had been threatened or harassed. Others had been sued by their former employers and spent years fighting legal battles. Maria made sure the foundation did everything possible to help them. The foundation also worked on changing laws and regulations to better protect whistleblowers. Maria hired a lobbying firm to work with members of Congress on new legislation. She testified at congressional hearings about her experience and the need for stronger protections. She met with senators and representatives to urge them to support whistleblower protection bills. Some politicians were genuinely interested in helping, but others were more concerned about protecting corporate interests. Maria learned that changing laws was a slow and frustrating process, but she kept pushing because she knew it was important. The foundation also worked with state governments on passing their own whistleblower protection laws. Some states had very weak protections, and workers in those states were particularly vulnerable to retaliation. The foundation drafted model legislation and worked with state legislators to introduce bills. Over time, several states passed new laws strengthening whistleblower protections, and the foundation could claim credit for helping make that happen. Lisa continued her investigative journalism work and won several awards for her reporting on corporate fraud. She and Maria remained close friends and often collaborated on stories. Lisa would investigate companies, and Maria's foundation would support the whistleblowers who came forward. Together, they exposed several major corporate scandals, including a pharmaceutical company that hid dangerous side effects of its drugs and a construction company that used substandard materials in building bridges and highways. Lisa's newspaper even created a special investigative unit focused on corporate fraud and corruption. The unit was partially funded by a grant from Maria's foundation. Karen Wu's law practice became one of the most successful whistleblower firms in the country. She took on dozens of cases and won hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements for her clients. She became a leading expert on whistleblower law and was frequently quoted in the media. She also taught a course on whistleblower law at a prestigious law school. Karen often spoke about how Maria's case had changed her career and given her a sense of purpose. She said representing whistleblowers was the most meaningful work she had ever done because she was helping people who were risking everything to do what was right. Nguyen found peace after testifying against Nexus. He got a job at a small aerospace company that had a strong reputation for safety and ethics. He was able to do engineering work he was proud of without being pressured to cut corners or ignore problems. He also became an advocate for engineering ethics and spoke at universities and professional conferences about the importance of integrity in technical work. He told students that engineers had a responsibility to put safety above profits and to speak up when they saw problems. He described his experience at Nexus as a cautionary tale about what happens when companies prioritize money over everything else. Peter stayed in touch with Maria and sometimes helped the foundation evaluate technical claims in cases involving engineering or safety issues. He said that working with the foundation helped him feel like he was making up for the years he had stayed silent at Nexus. As the years passed, Maria became a well-known public figure. She was invited to speak at colleges, conferences, and corporate events. She always accepted speaking invitations because she saw them as opportunities to spread her message about the importance of whistleblowing and corporate accountability. Her speeches were powerful and emotional because she spoke from personal experience. She would describe the night Richard Harper forced her to crawl and how humiliated she had felt. She would talk about the fear she experienced while gathering evidence and the loneliness of keeping such a huge secret. She would describe the attacks she faced from Nexus's lawyers and private investigators, and then she would talk about the satisfaction of seeing justice served and knowing that she had made a difference. Her speeches always ended with a call to action, urging people in the audience to speak up if they witnessed wrongdoing and to support whistleblowers in their own organizations. Maria also wrote a book about her experience called From Janitor to Whistleblower: My Fight Against Corporate Greed. The book became a bestseller and reached an even wider audience. In it, she provided details about her life before Nexus, her time working at the company, the process of gathering evidence, and the legal battle that followed. She also included chapters about the whistleblowers she had met through her foundation work, and the lessons she had learned about corporate culture and accountability. The book received positive reviews and was praised for being both personal and educational. Some business schools even assigned it as required reading in their ethics courses. The success of the book led to a documentary film about the Nexus scandal. Maria cooperated with the filmmakers and provided access to documents and interviews. The documentary featured interviews with Maria, Lisa, Karen, Peter, and several other key figures in the case. It also included footage from Richard Harper's trial and interviews with the families of the pilots who died. The documentary won several awards and was shown on national television. It introduced Maria's story to millions of people who hadn't followed the original scandal. Despite all her success and the positive attention, Maria never forgot where she came from. She stayed connected to working-class people and regularly visited with janitors, factory workers, and other low-wage employees. She understood that most of the people doing the hardest and most important work in society were invisible and undervalued. She made it a priority to highlight their contributions and advocate for better wages and working conditions. The foundation supported several labor organizing efforts and helped workers fight against unfair treatment by their employers. Maria also made large donations to organizations working on issues like income inequality, workers' rights, and corporate accountability. She gave money to legal aid organizations, labor unions, and community groups. She set up scholarship funds for the children of low-income workers. She funded research on corporate fraud and whistleblower protection. She used her wealth to support causes she believed in and to help people who were struggling. But Maria was careful not to let money change who she was as a person. She still lived relatively modestly, certainly not like someone worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She bought a comfortable house in a middle-class neighborhood, not a mansion in an exclusive area. She drove a regular car, not a luxury vehicle. She dressed simply and didn't wear expensive jewelry or designer clothes. She said she didn't need all that stuff to be happy and that she would feel uncomfortable living in a bubble separated from regular people. Her friends appreciated that Maria had stayed grounded despite her wealth and fame. They said she was still the same person she had always been, just with more resources to help others. Maria did allow herself some luxuries, though. She traveled to places she had always wanted to see, and she made sure her family back home was taken care of. She paid off her mother's mortgage and helped her siblings with their expenses. She took her whole extended family on a vacation to celebrate what she had accomplished. She also made sure to take care of her own health and well-being, seeing a therapist regularly and taking time to rest and recover from the stress of the previous years. On the 5-year anniversary of Richard Harper's conviction, Maria decided to visit the federal prison where he was incarcerated. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to go, but something drew her there. She drove to the prison, which was located in a remote area several hours from the city. When she arrived, she parked in the visitor lot and sat in her car for a while looking at the gray concrete building, surrounded by high fences and razor wire. She thought about Harper inside those walls, living a life completely different from the one he had known. She thought about how the man who had once been so powerful and arrogant was now just another prisoner. She didn't go inside or ask to see him. She had no desire to speak with Harper, or to hear whatever excuses he might offer. She simply sat in her car for about 20 minutes, acknowledging what had happened and then letting it go. She realized that she didn't feel angry anymore. The burning rage that had driven her for so long had faded and been replaced by a sense of peace. Maria started her car and drove away from the prison without looking back. As she headed down the highway, she felt a sense of closure that she hadn't expected. She had spent so much time focused on bringing down Richard Harper and Nexus Corporation that she hadn't fully processed everything that had happened. Now, 5 years later, she could finally see the whole picture. The janitor who had been forced to crawl had not only destroyed a corrupt empire, but had also helped create a better system for protecting whistleblowers and holding corporations accountable. That was a legacy worth being proud of. As Maria drove, she thought about all the people her foundation had helped over the past few years. She thought about the whistleblowers who had come to her scared and alone, and how the foundation had given them the support they needed to fight back against powerful corporations. She thought about the laws that had been changed and the reforms that had been implemented because of her advocacy work. She thought about the students and young professionals who had heard her speak and been inspired to stand up for what was right in their own lives. All of that had started with one night of humiliation and a decision to fight back instead of accepting defeat. The foundation continued to grow and expand its reach. Within 10 years of its founding, it had supported over 500 whistleblower cases and helped recover billions of dollars in fraud. The foundation had offices in multiple cities and employed a team of lawyers, investigators, and policy experts. It had become one of the most important organizations in the country, fighting corporate fraud and corruption. Maria remained actively involved in running the foundation, but she also brought in talented people to handle day-to-day operations. She hired a chief executive with experience running nonprofit organizations, and she assembled a board of directors that included former government officials, legal experts, and business leaders who believed in corporate accountability. The foundation's work earned recognition from government agencies, academic institutions, and other nonprofits. It received awards for its impact on whistleblower protection and corporate accountability. Major newspapers and magazines wrote stories about the foundation and its accomplishments. Maria was featured on lists of influential people and most admired women in business. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the whistleblowers themselves. Maria received hundreds of letters and emails from people thanking her for giving them hope and helping them through the hardest times of their lives. Many of these letters brought tears to her eyes because they reminded her why this work mattered. One letter came from a woman who had exposed fraud at a nursing home where elderly patients were being neglected and abused. She wrote that Maria's foundation had saved her life because she had been on the verge of giving up when the foundation stepped in to help. Another letter came from a man who had reported safety violations at a chemical plant. He said that without the foundation's support, he would have lost everything, and that he was grateful someone had created an organization to protect people like him. These letters reinforced Maria's commitment to continue the work no matter how difficult it became. She kept many of the letters in a special file and read through them whenever she felt discouraged or tired. The impact of Maria's actions extended beyond just the whistleblower community. The Nexus scandal had changed how many corporations operated, because executives realized they could no longer assume they could get away with fraud. The prospect of whistleblowers coming forward with evidence and receiving protection and financial rewards made corporate leaders think twice before engaging in illegal behavior. Several companies created stronger internal compliance programs and ethics training specifically because of what happened to Nexus. Industry associations developed new standards for corporate governance and accountability. Business schools added more ethics content to their curricula and used the Nexus case as a teaching example. All of these changes meant that Maria's decision to speak up had created ripples that touched millions of people. The military also made significant changes after the Nexus scandal. The Department of Defense implemented much stricter oversight of defense contractors and created new channels for employees to report safety concerns. They hired more auditors and inspectors to review contractor work and catch problems before they became dangerous. They also established a special office to work with whistleblowers and ensure their complaints were taken seriously. These reforms weren't perfect and there were still problems with defense contractors, but things were better than they had been before. Fewer defective weapon systems made it into the field, and soldiers were safer because of it. Maria took satisfaction in knowing that her actions had probably saved lives. As Maria got older, she started thinking about the long-term future of the foundation and her legacy. She wanted to make sure the foundation would continue its work long after she was gone. She set up a large endowment to provide permanent funding, so the foundation wouldn't have to rely on annual fundraising. She worked with her board to develop a succession plan for leadership. She mentored several young people who she hoped would eventually take over running the foundation. She also started working on a second book that would be more of a handbook for whistleblowers, providing practical advice on how to gather evidence, find legal representation, protect yourself from retaliation, and deal with the emotional stress of speaking up. She wanted to create a resource that future whistleblowers could use as a guide through the difficult process. The book would include contributions from lawyers, psychologists, investigative journalists, and other whistleblowers who could share their expertise and experiences. Maria also remained close with the key people who had helped her bring down Nexus. Lisa was now the editor of her newspaper's investigative unit and had won multiple awards for her journalism. She and Maria still met regularly for coffee and to discuss potential stories and cases. Karen had become one of the most successful whistleblower lawyers in the country and had argued cases before the Supreme Court. She served on the board of Maria's foundation and provided legal guidance on its operations. Peter had risen to become a senior engineer at his company and was known throughout the aerospace industry as someone with uncompromising integrity. He regularly spoke at engineering conferences about ethics and safety. The four of them, along with a few others who had played important roles in the case, got together once a year for dinner to remember what they had accomplished together. These dinners were always emotional as they reflected on how much had changed since that night when Maria had been forced to crawl across Richard Harper's office floor. 10 years after the scandal broke, Maria was invited to give a speech at a major business conference. The audience included hundreds of corporate executives from Fortune 500 companies. As Maria walked onto the stage, she looked out at all those powerful people in expensive suits and remembered how invisible she had been as a janitor. Now these same kinds of people were here to listen to what she had to say. She began her speech by telling her story from the beginning, describing her life as a janitor and the night of the humiliation. She watched as the executives in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then she talked about discovering the fraud at Nexus and making the decision to become a whistleblower. She explained the process of gathering evidence and building the case. She described the attacks she faced and the toll it took on her mental health and personal life. She talked about watching Richard Harper go to prison and seeing Nexus Corporation collapse. And then she shifted to talking about the broader implications of her case. She said that whistleblowers were essential to keeping corporations honest and that executives had a choice to make. They could run their companies with integrity and treat employees with respect, or they could cut corners and commit fraud and eventually face the consequences. Maria's speech received a standing ovation from the audience. Afterwards, dozens of executives came up to talk with her. Some thanked her for what she had done. Others asked for advice on how to create better ethics programs at their companies. A few admitted that hearing her story had made them think differently about their own business practices. Maria knew that not all of these executives would actually change their behavior. But if even a few of them did, then the speech had been worthwhile. One young woman who worked as an assistant to a chief executive pulled Maria aside and quietly asked for advice. She said she had discovered that her boss was falsifying financial reports and she didn't know what to do. Maria gave her a business card for the foundation and told her to call if she decided to come forward. She said the foundation would protect her and help her through the process. The young woman thanked her with tears in her eyes and walked away. Maria watched her go and hoped she would find the courage to speak up. These moments, more than the awards or the recognition, were what made all the struggle worthwhile. As Maria left the conference and headed home, she thought about how far she had come. From a janitor living paycheck to paycheck, to a wealthy philanthropist with influence and respect. From being forced to crawl like a dog to bringing down a $2 billion empire.